Frank Caprio, known for his empathetic rulings, leaned forward slightly in his chair. Across from him stood a man who looked more weary than guilty. He clutched a worn-out briefcase, his eyes betraying sleepless nights and endless worry. "Mr. Garcia, how do you plead?" Judge Caprio's voice was steady but warm. The man hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Guilty, Your Honor, but there's something you need to know." The room stirred. What could possibly justify his actions? What followed would leave the courtroom stunned and force everyone, including Judge Caprio, to confront the meaning of justice and compassion. Before diving into this remarkable story, don't forget to comment where you're watching from and subscribe so you never miss these heart-stirring courtroom moments. The heavy double doors of the municipal courtroom creaked open, revealing a man who, by appearance alone, might have gone unnoticed on a city sidewalk. But this morning, Miguel Garcia stood at the threshold of something far more intimidating than traffic or city streets, a courtroom where his good intentions had landed him in legal trouble. He walked in slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to physically shrink in a space built to judge. His shirt, though ironed with care, bore the wear and tear of many years, the collar thinning, the sleeves frayed just enough to be noticed. A tie, borrowed perhaps, or salvaged from a thrift store rack, clung around his neck, a bit too short, the knot pulled slightly off-center. Still, he wore it with quiet pride. As he approached the defendant's stand, he gave a nervous chuckle and scratched the back of his head. "I'm not much for dressing up, Your Honor," he said, the Bronx still humming faintly in his voice. The courtroom responded with a low ripple of laughter, not mocking, but warm, the kind that acknowledges honesty when it's heard. Even Judge Frank Caprio, a man known for his balance of authority and empathy, couldn't help but smile. "Well," the judge replied, adjusting his glasses with a twinkle in his eye, "you're in luck, Mr. Garcia. This is a courtroom, not a fashion contest, and you're dressed just fine for honesty." Miguel's small smile flickered as he glanced down at the stack of citations he held in his hand. The paper was slightly crumpled at the edges, perhaps from being stuffed in a glove compartment or carried too long in a coat pocket. The smile vanished as he cleared his throat. "I'm here for parking violations, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Multiple." There was a brief pause, as though even saying it aloud carried a weight he'd rather not own. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly. "Parking violations," he echoed, not with scorn but with curiosity. "That's a broad category, and it rarely tells the whole story." He tapped his pen lightly against the desk. "So go on. Start from the beginning." Miguel nodded, swallowed once, and began. "I work for a food bank," he said. "Been there 5 years. We deliver meals to senior citizens across the city, folks who can't get out of their apartments. Some don't have family. Some can't walk far or even get down the stairs." He paused, glancing out briefly at the courtroom gallery. Not for sympathy, but to ground himself. "My job is to make sure they eat. I load up my van with hot meals in the morning, and I go from building to building, knocking on doors, handing out lunches, sometimes just stopping to talk with someone who hasn't spoken to anyone all day." Judge Caprio listened closely, expression unchanged but attentive. "The thing is," Miguel continued, "most of these places, high-rise apartments, assisted living buildings, they don't have parking. Or if they do, it's reserved. Loading zones, hydrants, double parked next to trash bins. I've done it all. Every time I run up to the 8th floor with a hot meal, I come back down to a ticket." He held up one of the citations. "Every single time." There was no dramatics in his voice, no outrage or complaint, just fatigue, a man explaining the unavoidable cost of trying to do something good. "I'm not trying to get out of paying," Miguel said quickly, raising a hand as though to clarify. I'm just saying, what am I supposed to do? Let them go hungry while I circle the block looking for legal parking? Wait 20 minutes for a spot to open up while the food gets cold? It didn't feel right, Your Honor. Judge Caprio's eyes remained fixed on Miguel, and though his face was composed, the silence in the room said more than any expression could. Something in Miguel's words had struck a nerve, not just for the judge, but for everyone present. So, the judge said slowly, after a long pause, you knowingly parked illegally because the alternative was letting vulnerable people go without food. Miguel nodded. Yes, sir. I tried to be quick. I even put a sign in the windshield. Food delivery for seniors. I hoped the meter folks would understand. But they didn't, the judge said quietly. No, Your Honor, they didn't. A bailiff shifted slightly. Someone in the gallery murmured something barely audible, likely a word of support or sympathy. Judge Caprio looked down at the stack of tickets again, flipping through them with practiced hands. Each one told the same story. A van parked illegally for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes just 5. Each one written during lunchtime. Each one issued in front of an address known to house the elderly or disabled. As the judge continued to review the citations, the courtroom waited, suspended in that quiet space between truth and decision. And Miguel stood there, not as a criminal or a scofflaw, but as a man with calloused hands and a worn tie, doing the best he could in a world that doesn't always make room for compassion. The rustle of paperwork broke the silence as the city prosecutor, a composed woman with a sharp suit and a sharper tone, stood and approached the bench. In her hands, she carried a thick stack of documents, stapled in neat rows, each printed with the same header: City of Providence, Parking Violation Notice. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, Mr. Garcia has accumulated over $10,000 in parking fines over the past year alone. That is excessive by any standard. This court cannot ignore the magnitude of that debt. She placed the stack before the judge with a soft thud, and the courtroom seemed to inhale together. $10,000. The number echoed in the walls like a verdict itself. Judge Caprio looked down at the pile, flipping through the citations one by one. The dates ran like a calendar of devotion, nearly every weekday, some weekends. The fines ranged from $50 to $150, some marked unpaid, some doubled from penalties. After a moment, he looked up at Miguel. Mr. Garcia, the judge began, folding his hands. These fines didn't happen overnight. This wasn't a one-time mistake. So I have to ask, why didn't you come to court earlier? Why didn't you contest them when it might have helped? Miguel's expression tensed. He shifted slightly in his chair, and his voice, when it emerged, was laced with something between shame and frustration. I tried, Your Honor, he said, voice low but steady. The first few times I came down here, waited in line, explained everything. But I had to take time off work, and I'm paid by the hour. No deliveries, no pay, no rent. And I've got kids, a daughter in high school, a son just turned 7. Missing work wasn't just inconvenient. It meant lights out, groceries skipped, falling behind on the landlord. The courtroom fell quiet again, a quiet that wasn't just respectful. It was empathetic. A woman seated near the back, in a blue coat, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even the prosecutor's gaze softened. Miguel cleared his throat and continued, voice a touch stronger now. The people I deliver to, they're shut-ins. Most live alone. Some are veterans, others widows, many disabled. These meals I bring, it's all they get. Not just food, but a knock on the door, a few words. A reminder that someone knows they exist. No one else helps them, Your Honor. No one. He paused. I couldn't stop. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, processing the gravity of what he was hearing. There was a weight to Miguel's words that couldn't be measured in fines or court filings. They came from the corner of society the law rarely looks into, the working poor who carry others on their backs while barely staying afloat themselves. And yet, the judge said slowly, here you are, facing a mountain of debt. $10,000. Parking enforcement has done its job. The system has done what it was designed to do. Cite, penalize, collect. But I'm asking you now, Mr. Garcia, how do you propose to pay this? Miguel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down at the courtroom floor, scuffed, worn, much like himself. His voice cracked as he finally answered, I don't know, Your Honor. I don't have an answer. I just knew I had to keep doing my job, every day, whether the city liked it or not. He looked up, meeting the judge's gaze directly. I'm not trying to run away from it. I'm just asking for a little mercy. The courtroom held its breath. This wasn't a man making excuses. It was a man standing in the ruins of good intentions and impossible choices, the kind of choices so many face quietly, every day, without ever stepping into the courtroom spotlight. Judge Caprio steepled his fingers beneath his chin, taking a moment longer before speaking again. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held the kind of sorrow only a man who'd presided over thousands of human stories could carry. I've always believed that courts must do more than tally wrongs, he said gently. They must understand the people behind them, the context, the cost, not just financial, but moral, emotional, social. He turned back to the stack of tickets. The law is meant to keep order, but when the system begins punishing kindness, when it makes criminals out of caretakers, then maybe we need to re-examine which rules we enforce, and how. Miguel sat quietly, lips pressed together, unsure of what would come next. A punishment he couldn't afford, or something else. And though the courtroom didn't yet know it, the turning point was approaching. The fine might be on paper, but justice, real justice, was starting to emerge between the lines. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, fingers laced, the weathered grooves of his face reflecting more than decades of judicial service. They reflected understanding. For a long moment, he simply looked at Miguel Garcia, not as a defendant, but as a man. Mr. Garcia, the judge began softly, tell me about your family. Miguel's shoulders fell, the question cutting deeper than any accusation or reprimand ever could. He exhaled, slow and heavy, before speaking. I have a son, he said. Mateo. He just turned 10. The name lingered in the air like a prayer. Miguel's voice caught for a second, then steadied. His mom, she passed away 3 years ago. Sudden stroke. She was 36. A murmur of sympathy rustled through the courtroom, but no one dared interrupt. Even the prosecutor's previously rigid expression softened at the mention of loss. Miguel rubbed his hands together nervously, fingers rough with the calluses of labor, voice barely above a whisper. It happened fast. 1 minute she was asking me about dinner, the next, I was calling 911 and trying to remember how to do CPR from some video I saw online. He paused, shaking his head. Didn't matter. They said she was gone before the ambulance even got there. He looked up, his eyes glistening but dry. He had run out of tears long ago, the kind of tears that come in the dark while your child sleeps in the next room. Since then, Miguel continued, it's just been me and Mateo. The courtroom was silent, not out of formality, but out of reverence. It was the kind of silence that settles in when people are reminded of the fragility of life. Every night, after I come home from work, we eat dinner together. I help him with his homework, or try to, anyway. he added with a faint smile. He's a smart kid. Too smart, really. He can tell when something's wrong, even if I don't say anything. Miguel's voice cracked, and every night, before he goes to sleep, he asks me, "Papi, you're coming home tonight, right?" Miguel paused again, this time longer. And every night, I tell him, "Yes, mijo, I'll be home." He glanced down at the floor. "But lately, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm drowning, Your Honor. This debt, it's like I'm fighting an undertow. Rent, groceries, gas, school supplies, and now these fines? It's swallowing me whole." You could have heard a pin drop. A young court clerk subtly dabbed at her eye with the edge of her sleeve. Even the security guard at the back of the room, arms folded tightly across his chest, shifted uncomfortably, the mask of impartiality momentarily slipping. Judge Caprio leaned forward, voice low but unwavering. "And yet," he said, "you keep going. You keep delivering those meals. You keep working. You keep showing up." Miguel nodded, swallowing hard. "Because people depend on me." The simplicity of the statement carried a weight no legal document could match. It wasn't a defense. It was a vow. "Not just the people on my delivery list," Miguel continued, "but my son. He depends on me to keep our world together. I might be tired. I might be behind. But I get up every day, lace up my boots, and do what needs doing. Because if I stop, there's no safety net. There's just nothing." Judge Caprio said nothing for a moment, simply breathing in the truth of the man before him. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a window into a life stitched together with duty, held up by love, and fraying at the edges. After a moment, the judge's voice returned, a quiet rumble in the still room. "You know, Mr. Garcia," he said, "some people spend a lifetime looking for purpose. Others, like you, find it pressed into their hands without warning. A child to raise alone, a city to serve, a job that becomes a mission. And somehow, through it all, you carry on." Miguel nodded once more, silently. The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom. "This," he said, addressing everyone now, "is not a story of evasion. It's a story of responsibility, a story of sacrifice. The kind that doesn't fit neatly into our court forms, but deserves to be seen and understood." He turned back to Miguel. "I thank you for your honesty, Mr. Garcia, and for the love you show your son. That alone speaks volumes." Miguel lowered his eyes, quietly whispering, "Gracias, su señoría." And though the next minutes would bring legal decisions and formal language, it was this moment, a man revealing the beating heart beneath the burden, that would linger long after the case was closed. The weight of silence filled the courtroom again, not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward in his chair, his hands folded in front of him, fingertips resting lightly against one another in quiet contemplation. The years had taught him when to rush and when to wait. This was a moment to wait, to let the humanity of the situation settle over everyone present. "Mr. Garcia," the judge began, his voice slower now, tinged with introspection, "your case presents this court with a moral quandary." Miguel looked up, unsure whether the words spelled trouble or understanding. Caprio continued, "On one hand, the law is the law. We have parking regulations, not because we dislike generosity, but because cities require order. Rules ensure traffic flows, that emergency vehicles have access, that chaos doesn't overtake our streets." Miguel nodded slightly, accepting the premise. "But," Caprio added, raising a single finger to mark the shift, "on the other hand, your actions were not selfish. They were not reckless. They were not for personal gain. They were, quite simply, acts of compassion and necessity." He paused, letting the courtroom feel the tension between those two truths, law and morality. "This court doesn't often encounter cases like yours," the judge said, glancing down at the stack of citations again. "More often, we see people trying to skirt responsibility, evaders, repeat offenders who show no regard for others. But you, Mr. Garcia, are not that man." Miguel said nothing, but his eyes softened with quiet gratitude. Turning slightly in his chair, Judge Caprio addressed the prosecutor. "Counselor, tell me, has your office received any complaints from residents about Mr. Garcia's delivery practices? Has anyone filed a grievance about his parking or presence at these buildings?" The prosecutor, who had maintained her professional reserve, looked down at her notes and shook her head. "No, Your Honor. In fact—" She hesitated, then continued. "We've received a number of letters from tenants in those buildings, praising Mr. Garcia. Some refer to him as the meal angel. Others say he's the only visitor they've had in months. One even said he saved her life, caught her after she fell in the hallway, and stayed with her until EMS arrived." A soft murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom gallery. Miguel shifted uncomfortably under the praise, his instinct to deflect rather than accept it. Caprio nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "The city's parking enforcement ticketed this man for repeatedly stopping illegally, but the residents he serves, the very people affected by his actions, commend him." "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor confirmed. "It appears so." The judge exhaled deeply, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling for a brief moment of thought. Then he looked back at Miguel, this time with something approaching reverence. "It seems, Mr. Garcia," he said slowly, "that you're not only feeding the hungry, but also inspiring your community." Miguel looked stunned. The compliment seemed too large to fit within him. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," he said, almost apologetically. "That's exactly what makes it so remarkable," Caprio replied. He addressed the courtroom now, not just the defendant. "What do we do, as a society, when good deeds run afoul of bureaucracy? When the same city that gives out citations also receives thank you letters on behalf of the same man? What does it mean to uphold justice if, in the process, we fail to recognize the very heart of it?" No one answered, no one dared to, because the answer was hanging in the air already. "Rules matter," Caprio said, "but so does context, and it is the responsibility of this court, not just to apply the law blindly, but to weigh it with discernment, to see beyond the paperwork, to see the person standing in front of us." He leaned forward again, voice dropping just slightly, as if inviting Miguel into a private understanding. "You could have walked away from that job when the tickets piled up. You could have said, 'Not my problem.' But you didn't. You kept showing up, day after day, with hot meals and probably a tired back, and your son waiting at home. That, Mr. Garcia, tells me everything I need to know about your character." Miguel said nothing, but his eyes began to brim with tears. Not the tears of despair he'd carried into the courtroom, but those born of relief, of being seen. Judge Caprio turned one last time to the gallery, his voice clear and deliberate. "Let today be a reminder. The law must never become so rigid that it punishes goodness, and the courts must never become so detached that they forget who they serve, people." And with that, the courtroom, hardened by years of petty disputes and procedural rulings, softened. Everyone in the room, from clerks to spectators, understood that they weren't just witnessing a hearing. They were witnessing justice becoming something human. The courtroom had settled into a profound silence, suspended somewhere between justice and empathy. Judge Caprio, still absorbing the moral implications of Miguel Garcia's situation, prepared to respond, when a soft, hesitant voice from the back cut through the quiet. "Your Honor," a woman called gently, standing up from the third row. "May I speak?" All heads turned. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, with tired eyes and a lanyard around her neck that bore a faded city emblem. Her tone was respectful, but there was conviction behind it. A courtroom officer glanced at Judge Caprio, awaiting his cue. The judge, intrigued and ever open to community voices, nodded. "You may." The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She stopped just past the defense table, clutching a thin file folder to her chest. "My name is Rosa Delgado," she began, her voice gaining strength. "I'm a social worker with the Providence Senior Outreach Program. I work closely with the food bank that employs Mr. Garcia." She looked over at Miguel with a mix of warmth and concern. "And I've seen his work firsthand, not through stories, not through hearsay, with my own eyes." Miguel looked at her, surprised, but not ungrateful. He didn't know she'd come. Rosa took a steadying breath. "Mr. Garcia isn't just a delivery driver. He's a lifeline. He doesn't just drop meals at the door. He knocks, he waits, he talks. For many of our clients, he's the only face they see in a day, sometimes a week." She opened the folder, then closed it again, as if deciding her words meant more than her notes. "I remember one day last winter. There was a brutal snowstorm. I told our volunteers to stay home. Streets were iced over. Elevators were out in several of the older apartment complexes. One building had power outages on the upper floors." She paused, letting the image sink in. "But Mr. Garcia, he showed up anyway. He carried meals up 12 flights of stairs in the dark because the elevator was broken. 12 floors, more than a dozen apartments. Some of those folks didn't have heat, Your Honor. No way to cook. No way to go outside. Without him, they would have gone hungry. Maybe worse." There were audible gasps from the gallery. Several people exchanged glances. The weight of her testimony settled into the room like a second winter. Miguel looked down at the floor, his face slowly turning red. When Judge Caprio turned toward him, his voice was quiet but pointed. "Is this true, Mr. Garcia?" Miguel didn't respond right away. When he finally lifted his head, there was no bravado, no attempt to embellish. I was just doing my job," he said quietly. Rosa shook her head. "No, Mr. Garcia. You were doing more than your job. What you did went beyond any paycheck." Miguel smiled faintly, embarrassed by the attention. "I couldn't stay home knowing they had nothing. I thought, if it was my mom or my grandma up there, I'd want someone to show up." Judge Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable, but deeply focused. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for him to respond. But for the moment, he said nothing. Instead, he turned to the prosecutor. "Counselor, were you aware of this incident?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard. "No, Your Honor. We hadn't heard of it until now. But I don't doubt it. Ms. Delgado is a trusted public employee." Caprio nodded slowly. This case began with a stack of tickets, cold facts, citations, unpaid fines. But now, he gestured toward Rosa. "Now we have a picture of a man carrying meals up a dozen flights of stairs in the snow, not for glory, not for gain, but because someone had to." The judge turned back to Miguel. "It may be your job, Mr. Garcia, but how you do it says more about you than any resume ever could." Miguel blinked rapidly, his hands nervously wringing the edge of the table. "And Ms. Delgado," Caprio continued, turning to her, "thank you for speaking. This courtroom is better for it." Rosa nodded and quietly returned to her seat. As she sat, someone reached out from the row behind her and gently squeezed her shoulder. Judge Caprio looked down again at the citations, but this time they seemed smaller somehow, dwarfed by the scale of humanity they had come to represent. "This court," he said finally, "is no longer looking at a case of unpaid parking tickets. We are now considering the cost of compassion and the price a good man pays when systems fail to recognize service over technicality." There was nothing more to say, not yet. But the tide in the courtroom had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Something important had just happened. Justice, it seemed, was starting to lean not on the weight of the law, but on the strength of character. The room was still, breathless with anticipation. Judge Caprio leaned forward once more, his tone no longer that of a formal arbitrator, but of a father, a neighbor, a human being who had seen both the best and worst of people from the bench. "Mr. Garcia," he said gently, "you've shown this court, and this community, what true service looks like." Miguel looked up, his eyes rimmed red, lips pressed together to keep his composure. "You didn't come here today to plead innocence," the judge continued. "You didn't offer excuses. You didn't try to pass the blame. Instead, you stood here, humble and honest, asking not for a way out, but simply for understanding." He paused, the room silent, but for the soft creak of the judge's chair. "I've sat on this bench for a long time," Caprio said, his voice dropping to a more reflective register. "I've seen people lie, manipulate, threaten, even weep on cue to dodge accountability. But every so often, someone walks into this courtroom and reminds us why the law must have a heart." He glanced once more at the tall stack of citations resting near his gavel. Over $10,000 in parking fines. Each citation was a cold line of ink, but together they told the story of one man trying to keep others fed. "Now," he said, straightening, "the fines do still stand." Miguel gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. He looked down at his hands, then back at the judge. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I have $200 in my account, Your Honor. That's it. But, if that helps, I'll pay it all." A ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom gallery. A woman covered her mouth with her hand. Another man wiped his eyes quietly. Judge Caprio nodded thoughtfully, then looked directly at Miguel. "Here is my judgment," he said, his tone clear and unwavering. "I will reduce your total fines to the $200 you said you can afford, payable today." Miguel's eyes widened in disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out yet. The judge wasn't done. "The remaining balance, all of it, will be waived," he continued, "with one condition." Miguel straightened in his chair, waiting. "That you continue your work with the food bank, your current position, for another year. Same heart, same effort, same service to this community." There was a stunned pause, and then, like a collective exhale, the courtroom erupted. Applause broke out first from the back row, then rippled forward like a wave of shared joy. Even the bailiff, usually a stone of neutrality, gave a quick clap before catching himself. Rosa, the social worker, beamed from her seat, pride and validation radiating from her like sunlight. Miguel sat frozen, overwhelmed. His eyes filled, and tears streamed silently down his cheeks. He tried to speak, but had to swallow hard first. "Thank you," he finally managed, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down." "I promise," Judge Caprio smiled warmly. "I know you won't." The judge then turned to the court clerk. "Make the paperwork reflect the adjustment and ensure Mr. Garcia receives a copy of the judgment today." Then, addressing Miguel one last time, he added, "There are different kinds of debts in this world, Mr. Garcia. Some can be measured in dollars, others in dignity, service, and integrity. I believe you've already paid more than enough." Miguel wiped his face and nodded. "God bless you," he said softly. As the session moved on, people remained seated a little longer than usual, reluctant to break the spell of what they had witnessed. A courtroom where mercy wasn't weakness, but strength, where justice had a face, and today it looked a lot like understanding. The moment became more than a ruling. It was a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful laws aren't written in codebooks, but carved into our shared conscience. The belief that decency should never be punished, and courage in everyday acts must be recognized. And so, the gavel came down not just on the case, but on a moment of quiet triumph, a decision that restored not only one man's hope, but perhaps a bit of the room's collective faith in justice itself. Judge Caprio addressed the room. "This case reminds us that the law must balance justice with humanity. Mr. Garcia's actions speak louder than any fine ever could." As Miguel left the stand, he turned to Judge Caprio. "Thank you, Your Honor, for giving me a chance." Judge Caprio smiled. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Mr. Garcia." And so, the case of Miguel Garcia became a testament to the power of compassion. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe for more unforgettable courtroom moments. Let's keep spreading kindness, one story at a time.